News broke today of another terrorist attack in Tel Aviv. More than 200 missiles launched into Israel from Iran, with sirens sounding in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, in every major city across the country, as nearly an entire population took shelter in place. There is no better time than tonight to talk about the brutality of the Iranian regime, the most destabilizing force of evil in a region, and the puppet masters for the proxy armies who have wreaked havoc on millions of innocent people in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Iran, and of course in Israel. The attack appears far bigger than the last one in April, and it should be the clearest of indications that Western values, that peace and security, that the stability of the entire region are all at risk because of the fundamentalists that have for a generation taken Iran back into the Stone Ages. And over the last number of weeks, they were deeply wounded, they were humiliated, and they were finally weakened. And it should have been very simple to state unequivocally that Israel, especially on a day where millions were forced into shelters and innocent civilians were killed in a terrorist attack, that it had the right, the duty, and the responsibility to defend itself. It should be easy to unequivocally state that this country should fight to eradicate terror. And instead, we got this from a foreign minister who's not just naive about terror, but outside of her depth on almost every conversation since and before October 7th. And quite frankly, it's humiliating for her, and it's humiliating for the entire country. So instead of a comment on fighting terror, her words were the following. I'm going to quote: "The attacks from Iran will only serve to further escalate the region, and therefore that is why I've been in contact with my Israeli counterpart this morning, and I have been in contact with G7 foreign ministers, as well as Arab countries' foreign ministers. This is a very dangerous time for the Middle East, and we need to make sure that the war stops." That was her quote. She went on to tell reporters outside of this place, quote, "I need to make sure that there's no escalation, of course. Israel needs to be able to protect itself, and that's what we will continue to support, its security, and will support, of course, through the Iron Dome." She continued her quote, "At the same time, we need to make sure that parties sit down and the war stops, because we can see what will happen. There will be even further escalation, more further innocent civilians, including women and children, die, and that's what I said at the UN yesterday, and we need the war to stop." End quote. So if we are to understand this, the minister's position now is that Israel can intercept hundreds of incoming ballistic missiles from Iran, but that's exactly where the defense stops. Israel just needs to accept that these attacks happen and that their technological superiority can continue to provide 100% coverage. Unconcerned with the terror of Hamas and Hezbollah and the mullahs in Iran, and only capable of repeating these talking points, they've received high praise from some in her caucus. They've received confusion from others, embarrassment from some. And they were thanked. This minister was thanked by Hamas, a terrorist organization that this country was once unequivocal about wanting to defeat. We went on to talk again about a ceasefire on the day of a major escalation from Tehran. And as for her calls for the supposed 21-day ceasefire the G7 and some Arab countries were touting last week, it is worthwhile to remember, because nobody has said it in this House, that ceasefire negotiation didn't include any of the belligerent actors involved in this. The ones responsible for the ongoing terror attacks, they themselves were not in the ceasefire talks. So it was a ceasefire proposal that didn't involve anyone who was actually fighting. This is the minister who at the UN managed to offend even our most ardent allies in Canada with her inconsistent hum of moral equivalency, her incomprehensible message, and the very fact that Canada at the highest levels speaks from both sides of its mouth. It is the same minister who, alongside the Minister for Mental Health and the member from York Centre, was proudly photographed caressing the hand of a prolific terrorist and a Holocaust denier in the 19th year of his 4-year mandate, who set up a martyr fund to reward those who killed Jews. The member from York Centre demanded an apology from members of this House, and I will tell you, Mr. Speaker, she will never get an apology from any member of this House on this side for pointing to her dangerous, sanctimonious hypocrisy as she poses for pictures with terrorists instead of denouncing terror.
Yes.
I think her constituents actually deserve the apology, and I am almost certain that there is no apology that will ever convince anyone from her riding to make her a member of Parliament again.
Yes.
The Prime Minister came to Jewish communities after October 7th. We are almost a year from that date. He and members of the Liberal Party stood tall and promised full support. He gave them their word. But what have we seen since? We've seen protests targeting innocent people in Jewish neighborhoods, Jewish businesses, Jewish places of worship. They're not protesting Israel. They're not protesting the government of Israel. They're not even protesting MP offices. They are intimidating Jews, complete with anti-Semitic slogans, with flags, with chants, with banners in neighborhoods, in front of synagogues, in front of a senior's home right here in the nation's capital just last week, with silence from the MP. We've seen new lows in cancel culture as Israeli authors and artists themselves are deplatformed, as universities call for ideological purity to promote Hamas talking points, as IDF veterans are shamed, and as the leader of one of Ontario's largest unions gets to keep his job while celebrating, quote, resistance in the Middle East. We all know what that means. His watermelon army of radicals enjoys impunity of the worst anti-Semitism that I have seen in my lifetime in any labor movement. And we have seen unprecedented acts of physical violence too, at synagogues, at schools in Toronto, synagogues and schools in Montreal, cities from coast to coast like Vancouver to Fredericton. It goes beyond graffiti that we have all, unfortunately, gotten used to. It turned into firebombs. It turned into bricks through buildings. It turned into actual gunshots from actual guns. But where is the Prime Minister gone? As the headlines pile up, one after another, as stories get more and more outrageous, nothing except silence, and maybe, if we're lucky, the weakest of platitudes trying to say something and nothing at all. All while anti-Semitic hate crimes doubled in less than a year. It's 2024, they are up by 250%. All while the Jewish community suffered 70% of all religious-based hate crimes, despite making up less than 2% of the population. The Prime Minister is nowhere to be found. His foreign minister can't muster a coherent thought. His ministers are terrified of even giving the most basic condemnation. That's on him. He and his government lack the courage to speak out unequivocally and denounce what is happening right now, and the lack of courage to take new measures to protect our country by truly banning the IRGC agents whom are still here, Samidoun, and even properly vetting those who have been caught right before they committed a terrorist attack, either right here in our country's biggest city or south of the border in New York. The government awarded a citizenship to someone that they arrested on terror charges. They lack the courage to do just the bare minimum, and enforcing the laws in our criminal code. All while they deny security funding to the most vulnerable synagogues or community centers with excuses of red tape or, frankly, incompetence. We've known for a long time that the Prime Ministers and his MP lack any conviction at all. But never has this lack of conviction been more costly and put more people at risk than right now. He's playing politics because he's out of gas on everything else. He's playing politics with the gravest threat in the Middle East, security in a generation. And he's playing politics with the biggest challenge to Canadian religious freedoms since the Holocaust. And let me tell you how he does it. He sends one group of MPs to say one thing to one community, and he sends another group of MPs to say another thing to the other community. He gets members like the one from Mount Royal and Eglinton Lawrence to put out strongly worded tweets to say all of the right things to try and cover up the failures at the top while being shoved in the back corner of Parliament. Meanwhile, members like the one from Scarborough Centre call for a, quote, unequivocal embargo and actively parrot anti-Israel talking points. Two different MPs, two different messages to two different communities. He sends ministers to denounce UNRWA and announce that they stopped Canadian funding. But then they quietly resume funding just months later with millions of tax dollars. They can't even take a stand to condemn the immunity for UNRWA employees that participated in literal terrorism. And let's not forget their impeccable timing to reaffirm their unwavering support for UNRWA, just as UNRWA publicly admitted that Fatih al-Sharif, Hamas leader in Lebanon, was also running an UNRWA school and heading their school union. He was just buried in Hamas regalia, in case anyone missed it. And at what point does the Liberal government move UNRWA from the willful ignorance column to the willing co-conspirator column and stop sending Canadian tax dollars that is funding terror? They are doing so because they lack the courage. Like I said, they lack the conviction to do what's right instead of do what's popular. They lack the fortitude to stand with our allies through fire and through water instead of just freeloading as usual. And they lack the moral clarity to stand with the Jewish community, not just when it's easy, but also when it's difficult. There is a steep price to pay for this, Mr. Speaker, for our reputation abroad as it continues to crumble in the face of another equivocation, in the face of another reversal, in the face of another backtrack. We once were the country that took Juno Beach, that served in Korea, that brought peace to countless nations. We were the country now that can't even honor its basic commitments. Send a foreign minister who has a basic understanding of the threats in the region to any podium where those in the audience aren't questioning her own capacity and the words coming out of her own mouth. It is a steep price to pay for those living in the Middle East as they continue to live under the thumb of oppressive regimes like Hamas and like Hezbollah, as they continue to wait for their loved ones to come home, and as they continue to yearn for peace and freedom. But it's also a steep price to pay for the people living here in Canada. And it hasn't been this hard to be a Jewish Canadian for a very long time. How couldn't it be when you can't hang a mezuzah on your door at your home or at your university dorm, and frankly, in almost every Jewish neighborhood that's happening? How couldn't it be when you can't wear a kippah without being followed or verbally harassed or even spat on in this country? How couldn't it be when you go to synagogue and you find out again that it's been vandalized? And how couldn't it be when you send your kids to a Jewish school and you can't trust that they are going to come home at the end of the day? But these are not just attacks against the Jewish community, they are attacks against everyone. And when the inherent rights of religious freedom, of speech, of assembly, or just plain dignity are denied to one group, it is very easy for people to deny them to another group. And when we turn a blind eye to injustice happening here at home, they persist, and it gets worse. My parents came to this country for freedom, and I am so glad that they did, and millions of others came to this country for freedom. But I wonder if they saw the anti-Semitism here today, that they would make that same decision. Because it's been taking place in this country for far too long. And it's not hyperbole. It's a real thing that's happening. And the other side better wake up. Yeah. The emails I get from constituents telling me, I want to stay in Canada, but I don't know if I can anymore. They tell me that freedom, the very essence of our country, is in great peril, and they're actually scared in 2024 as Jews in this country. And when we lose that, Mr. Speaker, we lose something much bigger than ourselves. It's not too late to get it back, but it's going to take far more effort than the window dressing and the posturing that this government put forward so far. But since the members of the NDP have become unrecognizable in their pursuit of division in this country and lack the respect for Western democratic values, unable to muster even the courage to stand on the side of allies, brought a request to discuss the carnage in Lebanon with barely a mention of Hezbollah. Let's go through a timeline so they can join us here in the real world. October 7th, that's Hamas's attack on Israel, the worst attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. Hezbollah immediately escalated that aggression, launching more than 9,000 missiles, rockets, and drones on northern Israel. It has been evacuated for the better part of a year. After doing the bidding of these terrorists, July 27, 2024, an attack on Druze children by Hezbollah occurred in the northern Golan Heights. A rocket fired by Hezbollah struck a soccer field where children were playing. They killed 12 children, teenagers. They injured dozens more. So now, in response to these attacks, Israel has launched the largest military campaign against Hezbollah since 2006. The operation targets Hezbollah's military infrastructure, aiming to significantly degrade the group's capabilities. And we used to be on the side of fighting terrorism. And in this part of the House, we still are. And that brings us to the elimination of one of the most prolific terrorists that ever was, ending a 30-year reign of terror when he dragged his country into one war after another, indiscriminate in his terror, Israelis, Americans, the death of thousands of Lebanese, of Syrians during his bloody rule, and he enjoyed very little support from his Arab neighbors and the Arab League and the US and the EU and Canada, who designated him a terrorist, his group a terrorist. So to watch these flags fly in the streets without a peep from anybody in this House is frankly unforgivable. To watch members of this House stand in rallies alongside Hezbollah flags is unforgivable. No one wants to see the loss of life, Mr. Speaker. It's why we're here talking about this anywhere. But it must be said in this debate that the rulers of Hamas, of Hezbollah, and the tyrants in Tehran are the cornerstone of suffering, and they must come to an end. The people of Lebanon, the people suffering in Gaza, the hostages still in the grips of the barbaric terror, the brave Iranian people who have taken to the streets to weaken their regime, they should be the people that we seek to fight for. This regime is responsible for stoning women in soccer fields, for throwing gay people off of roofs, and to watch members of parliament line up at rallies where they are flying their flag, again, Mr. Speaker, is frankly unforgivable. We shouldn't be a focus on appeasing the tyrants, not here and not anywhere, the dictators, the murderers, the forces of hatred in power in the Middle East. We shouldn't be worried about placating the violent, spiteful mob. But that is what this country has become. And that is what we are doing right now. And Mr. Speaker, it is a shame. And it will change the day we elect the member from Carleton as the next Prime Minister of this country.
Yeah.